everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and on today's episode, we are going to talk about familiar spirits. And I am excited for this one because I honestly kind of had a feeling about this one winning the poll on last episode, and I'm kind of glad it did. So, familiar spirits, this is one of those topics in the occult world that is highly talked about. It's often misunderstood, but also holds a few different meanings and even names throughout magical traditions. What familiars definitely are not is your house cat who hangs on your altar, your curious dog when you do spells, or any other pet. Even though that might be kind of disappointing for some of you or most of you, really, when we look at what real familiars do, you would rather it not be your loved pet. And media, of course, has ran with this idea of, the witch with her familiar like cats, crows, or dogs, or even toads, which has led to this big misunderstanding and sort of left the real familiars hidden in plain sight. So, familiar spirits really do a lot more for us within the spirit realm and really are our front lines. You don't really want your pet taking the energetic brunt for everything that they do. Your house cat may be psychically sensitive or your dog might be, extra attuned to the spirits around us, but they won't teach you advanced astrology or even help you negotiate with other spiritual entities. And, these pop culture images of witches with their animal companions have created this completely false idea that familiar work is cute and harmless and mostly about bonding with your pets. But working with real familiar spirits can be pretty intense. It's demanding and sometimes dangerous, which is exactly why it is so powerful. And the historical evidence makes it pretty clear that familiar spirits are not animals. They might appear as animals, and they might take animal forms for convenience or camouflage, but they are distinct non human intelligences with their own agendas and capabilities. The confusion, comes from the fact that familiar spirits often choose to appear in animal forms because these shapes are familiar, they're non-threatening, and easily dismissed by skeptics. But the intelligence behind that animal appearance is something completely different from actual animal consciousness. Think of it like, an actor wearing a costume. Just because someone is dressed as a dog doesn't make them an actual dog. The familiar spirit is using the animal form as a convenient interface for interacting with the physical world. But the mind behind that form has capabilities that really no biological animal could possibly possess. And this is why historical accounts consistently describe familiar spirits as being able to shapeshift between multiple forms, because they're not actually tied to any one physical manifestation. Going back to the Malleus Maleficarum, which actually does address this distinction pretty directly, warning that demons do take the forms of animals to deceive the faithful, but acknowledging that these are not actual animals, but spiritual entities using animal appearances. The text goes on to describe how these familiar spirits can perform tasks that no real animal could accomplish. Things like gathering information from distant locations, influencing people's dreams, manipulating weather patterns, and carrying messages between practitioners, even. And medieval accounts consistently describe these familiar spirits as having intelligence and knowledge that far exceeds that of ordinary animals. They can speak, usually telepathically, they can write and read, and they understand complex magical theory, and they can make strategic decisions about magical operations. So, some of these accounts describe familiar spirits as having access to information and perspectives that their human practitioners don't have. They can observe situations from multiple angles, travel to a practitioner has never been, and understand the motivations and even intentions of people the practitioner has never met. And this kind of, omniscient perspective is completely beyond what any biological animal could provide, no matter how physically sensitive it might be. The historical sources also describe familiar spirits as having their own opinions, their own preferences, and even personal conflicts with other spirits, which, if you are a practitioner who kind of, is very spirit based, this is no surprise that spirits can have conflicts just like people do. and, a level of individual personality and agency that goes far beyond animal consciousness into something more like what we would expect from separate intelligent species. And the reality is that familiar spirits represent one of the most powerful forms of magical partnership that is available to practitioners. When you have a real familiar spirit, not a pet, not wishful thinking, but an actual entity that has agreed to work with you, your magical practice becomes exponentially more effective. You have access to knowledge that you couldn't gain on your own, even protection that operates 24/7 without your conscious effort, and the ability to influence situations and people in ways that would be impossible through just ordinary magic. And you could think about it like this: if magic is about manipulating energy and reality to achieve your goals, having an actual spiritual entity working on your behalf is like the difference between doing everything by hand versus having your Word document or any sort of software on a computer assisting you. These aren't just vague spiritual influences or psychological projections. These are distinct beings with their own intelligence, their own magical capabilities, and their own reasons for wanting to work with, human practitioners. So, that being said, let's start with what the historical record actually tells us about these familiar spirits. Because I not only think this is super interesting, but it's kind of like evidence in a way, it's more specific and detailed than most people realize. These weren't vague spiritual concepts that people made up or even romanticized. They were practical magical relationships with very clear protocols. There are established hierarchies and documented results. When you start digging into medieval grimoires and rich trial records even in the historical accounts and texts, from actual practitioners, what emerges is a consistent picture of familiar spirits as real, functional, magical partnerships that could dramatically enhance your capabilities. And the instructions are pretty detailed. Hierarchies are mapped out, and the results are described in ways that make it clear these weren't just psychological phenomena or even cultural superstitions. So, really, we're talking about actual spiritual technology that was widely known and used by serious magical practitioners for really centuries. And the most fascinating part is how consistent these descriptions actually are across different time periods, even geographic regions, and completely different traditions. The Lemegeton, better known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, is probably our most detailed source for understanding how familiar spirits actually work within at least the demonic magic or the Goetia. This, 17th century grimoire doesn't just describe the 72 spirits of the Goetia, it specifically details which of these entities are known for granting familiar spirits to worthy practitioners. And I mean, pretty specifically, we're not talking about, vague hints or subtle implications. The text literally states gives good familiars on most of these guys. Or things like can grant spirits for magician's use, or you can find provides faithful servants in spiritual form. Take Paimon, for example. The text describes him as one of the most powerful kings who can teach all arts and sciences and other secret things and can reveal all earthly treasures and give, give dignity and confirm the same. But what's really interesting is Paimon is specifically noted for granting familiar spirits to magicians who approach him correctly and offer the appropriate tribute. These familiars appear as various animals but possess intelligences far beyond the ordinary creatures. And the Lemegeton describes these familiars as being able to teach their practitioners advanced magical techniques, provide information about these hidden treasures or secrets, and even carry out complex magical operations independently. And Paimon's familiars are described as having a hierarchy of their own. Some are better at divination work, others excel at influence magic, and still others specialize in protection or even warfare applications. Bjor is another demon from the Lemegeton who's known for providing familiar spirits, and particularly for healing work and herbal knowledge. The text describes Bjor, which can grant practitioners familiars that appear as small animals, but they actually guide you to medicinal plants. They warn you of illness and even perform healing on others from a distance. And what makes Bjor's familiars unique is their connection to the natural world and the the plant knowledge. These aren't just spirits that happen to know about herbs, they're entities that are really said to lead you to specific plants at the right time of year, in the right conditions, for particular magical or healing purposes. And some accounts describe Bjor's familiars as being able to appear in dreams, to provide diagnostic information about illness, or even visit sick people directly and begin healing processes before the practitioner arrives. And the text also mentions that these familiars have an unusual ability to work with plant spirits and natural entities, essentially acting as this intermediary between human practitioner and the broader spiritual ecosystem of the natural world. And then there is Marcosius, who the Lemegeton describes as granting familiars specifically for protection and warfare magic. These familiars are said to be fiercely loyal to their practitioners and capable of inflicting both physical and spiritual harm on enemies. What's really intense about Marcosius's familiars is that they are described as, having what we might call a warrior ethos. They don't just protect passively, they actively hunt down threats and eliminate them. The text mentions that these familiars can cause nightmares, accidents, and even physical illness in people who threaten their practitioners. And they're also noted for their ability to gather intelligence on enemies, discovering their weaknesses, learning their plans, and finding ways to undermine their efforts. Some accounts describe Marcosius's familiars as being able to influence the dreams and thoughts of these hostile people, gradually turning them away from their aggressive intentions or even causing them to forget why they were angry in the first place. So, when it comes to gaining familiars, more traditionally, there are two primary ways familiar spirits enter into relationships with humans. They can be given as gifts from either higher demonic or planetary authorities, which we'll go into in a little bit, or they can be approached directly in the astral space. And this distinction is incredibly important because it really affects everything about the relationship: how you obtain the familiar, what obligations you have towards it, how powerful it is, and even how long the relationship might last. And, the historical sources are pretty clear that these are two completely different approaches with different risks, benefits, and even requirements. And understanding which route you want to take is essential before you even begin attempting to establish any kind of familiar relationship. It's not just a matter of personal preference, your experience level, your magical goals, or even really your personality type. All these things will, determine which approach is more likely to be successful and even safe for you. So the given familiars are what you get through your formal pacts with the demonic spirits or kings or the planetary intelligences. When you successfully conjure an entity like Paimon or Agris and establish a working relationship, they might grant you a familiar spirit as part of the arrangement. These familiars are essentially extensions of the granting entity's will and power, and specifically assigned to work with you. What makes this approach so powerful is that you're not just getting a random spiritual entity, you're getting one that comes with, the full authority and backing of a major demonic or planetary force. Think of it like having a letter of introduction from someone incredibly powerful. These other entities will treat your familiar with respect because they know who's standing behind it. And the downside is that, these relationships come with more formal obligations. You're not just working with the familiar, you're maintaining a relationship with the entity that granted it. And this means regular offerings, specific devotional practices, and commitments to use the familiar's power in ways that align with your benefactor's interests. It's more like having a job than having a pet. There are pretty clear expectations and consequences for not meeting them. So the approached familiars are completely different. These are entities that you encounter and negotiate with directly in astral spaces. In the astral plane, sometimes you can encounter entities who are willing to establish familiar relationships without going through higher demonic authorities. So these relationships tend to be more egalitarian, but also more unpredictable. Think of it like the difference between being introduced to someone by maybe a mutual friend versus meeting someone at a bar. The second approach might lead to more interesting conversations, but you have no idea what you're getting into. Approached familiars often have their own agendas and may be more willing to challenge or question you. They might refuse certain tasks or offer alternate suggestions or even temporarily disappear if they disagree with how they're being used. On the positive side, though, these relationships can be incredibly rewarding because they're based on genuine mutual interest rather than a formal obligation. An approached familiar that chooses to work with you long term is essentially saying that it just finds you interesting and valuable and even enjoyable to be around. The Picatrix actually describes both methods, though it recommends the formal approach through established hierarchies for most practitioners. The text warns that approaching unfamiliar entities directly in astral spaces can result in deceptive or hostile relationships. Yes, spirits can absolutely lie. While familiars granted through proper demonic channels come with built in protections and clear boundaries. What the Picatrix is really saying is that when you go through established spiritual hierarchies, you have recourse if things go wrong. If a familiar granted by Paimon starts causing problems, you can appeal to Paimon directly. If you approach some random astral entity and it turns out to be hostile or deceptive, you are essentially on your own. And the text also mentions that entities willing to make deals with humans in unstructured astral encounters are often doing so because they can't or won't work within the formal spiritual hierarchies, which might be a red flag about their intentions or capabilities to begin with. However, the Picatrix does acknowledge that some of the most powerful and unique familiar relationships come from direct astral encounters, particularly for practitioners who have developed exceptional astral projection abilities and, big one here, spiritual discernment. So, even the witch trial records give us incredible insight into how these relationships actually functioned in practice. Of course, we have to take them with a grain of salt, even though, you know, there is also the whole reading between the lines of the Christian bias and obvious coercion. What's fascinating about these records is that they often contain details that the court scribes probably didn't understand, but dutifully recorded anyway. When you compare these trial transcripts to what the grimoires say about familiar spirits, the similarities are pretty striking. The accused practitioners describe relationships, feeding practices, communication methods, and spiritual hierarchies that match the magical texts almost perfectly. This suggests that either the people were incredibly well versed in formal magical literature, very unlikely given most were illiterate rural practitioners, or they were describing real experiences that just happened to align with traditional magical knowledge. The trial of Elizabeth Southerns, better known as Demdike, in the 1612 Pendle witch trials, includes her detailed confession about her familiar spirit named Tib. That's just an adorable name to me. But according to the records, Tib appeared to her first as a brown dog, then later as a young man, and eventually as various other forms. Tib allegedly taught her magical techniques, warned her of danger, and carried out tasks on her behalf over a period of 20 years. What's really fascinating is the level of detail in these records. Demdike described how Tib would appear to her in dreams to provide advance warning about law enforcement or hostile neighbors, how he would teach her new spells by showing her visualizations of the actual magical process, and how he could appear at distant locations to carry out cursing work without her having to travel there herself. And the court records also note that she fed Tib regularly with her own blood, usually from a small cut on her finger, and that he would sometimes demand payment in the form of her life force when he performed particularly difficult tasks. This feeding practice aligns perfectly with traditional familiar feeding protocols documented in the medieval texts. So, really, this suggests that Demdike was working with a genuine familiar spirit rather than just making up stories to satisfy her interrogators. Another one is the trial of Anne Whittle, also known as Chaddix, from also the same Pendle trials, which describes her familiar spirit called Fancy, who appeared as, again, a brown dog, but could also take human form. The records indicate that Fancy would perform magical tasks for Chaddix, including cursing her enemies and protecting her from other practitioners' magic. But what makes Chaddix's case really, really cool is that, she described Fancy as having what we might call a professional rivalry with Demdike's familiar Tib. And according to the trial records, these two familiars would sometimes engage in what can only be described as magical warfare, with each trying to undermine or block the other's operations. This detail is incredible because it suggests, that familiar spirits maintain their own relationships and even conflicts independent of their human practitioner. And Chaddox also testified that Fancy could gather information about people's private lives by eavesdropping on conversations, reading letters, and even influencing people to reveal secrets they wouldn't normally share. She describes using this intelligence gathering capability to identify wealthy targets for her magical services or to discover which of her neighbors might be planning to accuse her of witchcraft. So, even more detailed are the continental European witch trials, which contain extensive descriptions of familiar spirit relationships. The trial of Walpurga Hosmanen in Bavaria in 1587 includes her testimony about multiple familiar spirits who served different functions, one for weather magic, one for healing, one for cursing. She described obtaining these familiars through formal rituals involving demonic entities, which matches the grimoire protocols again almost perfectly. But what's really striking about Hosmanen, sorry, case is how specialized her familiars actually were. Her weather familiar could allegedly bring rain, cause storms, or create fog to provide cover for her activities. Her healing familiar could diagnose illnesses by examining people's auras, recommend specific herbal treatments, and even perform what sounded like energy healing at a distance. And her cursing familiar specialized in what she called slow work, gradually undermining people's health, luck, or relationships over months or years rather than causing immediate dramatic effects. Court records note that she maintained separate feeding schedules and housing arrangements for each familiar, which suggests, this level of organizational complexity that goes well beyond just a simple folk belief. Which, again, if you know anything about keeping multiple spirits, this part is pretty important. So, moving beyond the witch trials, we have documented accounts from even educated practitioners like Dr. John Dee, the famous Elizabethan magician who worked with what he called spiritual creatures. And that clearly functioned as familiar spirits. Even though he couched his practice in Christian terminology to avoid persecution, these extensive journals document his conversations with these entities, their advice on magical operations, and their assistance in his alchemical and divinatory work. Dee described these spirits as having distinct personalities and areas of expertise, exactly like what we see in traditional familiar spirit relationships. Some of his spiritual contacts specialized in revealing hidden knowledge, others providing guidance about even political matters, and still others in assisting with complex alchemical processes. These records also show that these relationships required ongoing maintenance, regular scrying sessions, specific offerings, and careful attention to the spirit's preferences and even requirements. And these case, I think, is just so valuable because in his journals, they were never intended for publication or public consumption, really. So they likely represent genuine accounts of his magical practice rather than a carefully crafted propaganda. So let's now talk about Henrik Cornelius Agrippa. It's the Agrippa. He wrote about his own familiar spirit in his correspondence, describing it as a black dog that could appear and disappear at will and possess knowledge of future events. And really, what I think Agrippa's count makes it so, credible is that he was writing private letters to trusted colleagues, not trying to impress anyone or promote his magical practice. He described how the familiar would warn him about political dangers, advise him on which patrons to approach for support, or even predict the outcomes of various scholarly disputes he was involved in. The familiar apparently had a particular talent for understanding human psychology and political maneuvering, which helped Agrippa navigate, the dangerous waters of the 16th century European court politics, where the wrong magical reputation could absolutely still get you executed. And when Agrippa died, the familiar allegedly disappeared, supporting the traditional teaching that familiar relationships are tied to specific practitioners and don't transfer to others. This detail actually shows up in multiple historical accounts. Familiar spirits seem to have some kind of binding to their human partner that doesn't survive physical death. Some grimoire traditions suggest that this binding is what prevents familiar spirits from becoming independent entities that might cause problems for other people after their practitioner dies. It's essentially a built in safety mechanism that keeps these, entities from accumulating in the physical world over time. More that I want to talk about is the Italian priest in Magus, uh, Giulio? I don't know how to say the name. I'm so sorry. Caesar Vanini, who was executed for heresy in 1619. So before his death, Vanini described working with multiple familiar spirits that he had obtained through formal demonic conjurations. These familiars helped him with divination, healing, what we called, operations of love and hatred. He admitted to these practices even under threat of execution, which I think really reveals how valuable these relationships were to him. And according to the court records, Vanini described his familiars as having distinct personalities, again, in these specializations. And, one was excellent at revealing hidden information about people's romantic entanglements. Another could cause or cure various illnesses. And a third specialized in what he called emotional alchemy, gradually changing how people felt about each other or about specific situations. Vanini also testified that his familiars required different types of feeding. One consumed wine and honey, another required blood offerings, and the third fed on what he described as the essence of human emotions during things like intense experiences of sexual encounters or moments of extreme grief. So, beyond the demonic hierarchy, the planetary intelligences also grant familiar spirits to practitioners who approach them correctly. The Heptameron and other planetary magic texts describe how each planetary sphere has its own types of familiar spirits with specific capabilities. What makes planetary familiars particularly interesting is that they come from very defined specializations that reflect the planetary correspondences. Unlike the demonic familiars, which tend to be more generalist entities capable of handling a wider range of tasks, planetary familiars are more like highly trained specialists. This makes them excellent for practitioners who have specific magical goals or who want to develop particular areas of expertise. The approach for counteracting planetary intelligences differs really significantly from the demonic conjuration. Instead of a formal circle work and commanding language, planetary magic typically involves working with appropriate planetary hours, using corresponding colors and incense, and approaching the intelligences as respected teachers rather than maybe an entity to be more commanded, I guess. And, the relationships tend to be more collaborative and educational, while the demonic familiar relationships are often more transactional. Not always. I know some people will whine and, say, obviously, everyone's experience with these entities varies greatly. And even how you approach your own spirit work will always vary. But moving on, solar familiars are described as excellent for work involving authority, leadership, and gaining recognition. They can appear as golden or bright colored animals and, help practitioners influence people in positions of power. Solar familiars have the ability to enhance their practitioners' charisma and social standing. And these entities specialize in what we might call gravitational magic, which like essentially making their practitioner the center of attention in social situations, causing people to naturally defer to their opinions and creating opportunities for advancement and recognition. Lunar familiars specialize in divination, dream work, and psychic development. They typically appear as silver or white animals and can enhance their practitioners' intuitive abilities dramatically. These lunar familiars can operate in the dream space, even and the unconscious realms. They can gather information through dreams, influence people's subconscious minds, and even facilitate astral travel and out of body experiences. Mercurial familiars are masters of communication, learning, and rapid task completion. They often appear as like quick moving animals, things like small birds or small mammals and can help with everything from language learning to business negotiations. These familiars excel at information processing, multitasking, and creating connections between seemingly unrelated concepts or people. Now, familiars given to you from intelligences from Venus specialize obviously in love magic, this artistic inspiration and social influence. These familiars usually come in like very quote beautiful animals or birds and can help practitioners with everything from attracting romantic partners to succeeding in creative endeavors. And these familiars influence emotions and create harmony in social situations. They're masters of what we might call social alchemy, transforming conflict into cooperation, indifference into attraction, and discord into creative collaboration. Now, intelligence is ruled by Mars, grants familiars that are obviously fierce protectors. They are excellent for any work involving conflict, courage, or breaking through obstacles. These can appear as more of the predatory animal type and can help you with defensive magic, competitive situations, and removing people or situations that are, blocking your progress. And these familiars have a warrior ethos again, so it's not really suited for any sort of subtle or gentle work. They're more like spiritual bodyguards and enforcers. Now, Jupiter familiars will focus on expansion, prosperity, gaining social status. They tend to be more large and, kind of regal animals. They don't always appear as animals. I'm just listing the animals because that's usually um, what our human brains can, you know, experience the best when it comes to spirits and really what they look like, because sometimes we can't really comprehend what they actually look like. So it's pretty common to see things like during conjurations to ask the spirit to approach you or appear to you in a way that is understandable to you. Anyway, okay, so Jupiter is really good for opening doors and creating opportunities and attracting abundance in all of its forms. And finally, I want to talk about Saturn familiars, which specialize in binding magic or banishing work and even long-term strategic planning. And these are more of the serious and demanding planetary familiars, requiring significant discipline and commitment from the practitioner, but offering very powerful abilities in return. So now that we've established what familiar spirits actually are and where they come from historically, let's start to get into the more practical stuff. How you can potentially obtain one yourself, because this isn't about wishful thinking or, declaring your pet to be your familiar. This is about real traditional magic protocols that require serious commitment and proper preparation and a deep understanding of what you're getting yourself into. So before we get into the specific techniques, I think it's important for you to understand that familiar spirit work is not casual magic. These are long term relationships that can last years or even decades, and they come with real obligations on both sides. You can't just try this out for a few weeks and then decide it's not for you. Once you establish a familiar relationship, you're committed to maintaining it or formally ending it through appropriate magical protocols. These entities we're discussing are real intelligences, with their own power and agendas, and if the relationship goes badly, they can cause serious problems in your life. Said, for those who are ready for it, familiar spirit work represents some of the most powerful and effective magic available to human practitioners. These relationships can dramatically accelerate your magical development, provide you with capabilities you couldn't even achieve on your own, and connect you with spiritual realities that most people never experience. So the first decision you need to make is which spiritual hierarchy you want to approach for a familiar spirit. Again, the two main options are the, demonic entities from the Goetia or planetary intelligences from the traditional celestial hierarchies. Each has its own advantages and requirements, and honestly, the choice often comes down to your experience level and what you want the familiar really for. If you're newer to this kind of work or want a familiar for specific purposes like divination or healing, the planetary route might be more appropriate. Planetary intelligences tend to be more educational and collaborative, and, their familiars usually come with clear specializations that make them easier to work with for focused goals. And if you're on more of the experience side, with demonic magic and want a familiar that can handle a wide range of tasks, demonic entities are probably the way to go. Demonic familiars tend to be more powerful and versatile, but they also require more formal pact making and come with stricter obligations on your part. They're also the approached option. seeking out entities directly in the astral space, but this really is only recommended for practitioners who have extensive experience within the astral realm or, the whole projection. And I definitely want to say spiritual discernment. The risk of encountering deceptive or hostile entities is much higher with this approach, and you don't have the kind of built in protections that come with working through established hierarchies. You really have your own built in protections to lean on. So you need to lean on your own experience for discernment and vetting the right spirit. You can't really obtain a real familiar spirit without the proper conjuration work. And this means, full formal rituals with circles or seals or, whatever route you go with. And the traditional, hopefully the traditional words of power, if you can get your hands on the texts, we're not talking about lighting a candle and asking nicely. Personally, no matter what my practice looks like, I like to change very little about this process if it is, disclosed within the text or grimoires, which they are pretty descriptively. And, like the Lemegeton, for example. Even if it's way too ceremonial for what I usually do on a day to day, keep it nearly 100% true to the text. And this is important, really, to grant the proper intelligence with respect and authority. I also do want to just say that sometimes these rituals require multiple sessions before the entity will even acknowledge you, let alone even consider granting you a familiar. For planetary familiars, you'll work with the traditional planetary hours, again, your colors, incenses, and sigils associated with each sphere. So the protocols and texts like the Heptameron provide detailed instructions for approaching each planetary intelligence with proper respect and authority. The key thing here to understand is that these aren't just empty ceremonial forms. They're, tested spiritual technologies that have been refined over centuries of practice. Well, maybe not refined, but you get what I'm meaning. So, you're not just asking for a familiar spirit. You're negotiating the terms of a formal magical pact. And this means discussing what you'll provide in return for the familiar services. Traditionally, this involves regular offerings, specific devotional practices, or commitments to use the familiar's power in certain ways. This isn't a casual friendship, it's a formal magical contract with real obligations on both sides. Entity granting the familiar wants to know that you're serious, you're worth your salt, you're reliable, and capable of maintaining the relationship long term. They might require you to perform certain ritual acts on specific days, make regular offerings of particular substances, or commit to using the familiar's abilities for specific types of work. And some entities want evidence that you're actively developing your magical skills and knowledge. They're not interested in granting familiars to casual dabblers who might neglect or misuse them. Others want assurance that you won't use the familiar for purposes that conflict with their nature or interests. And the negotiation process itself can take even a couple ritual sessions itself. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that your initial request might get refused. This isn't personal, it just means that you need to develop your skills further or adjust your approach before trying again. When a familiar spirit has actually been granted to you, it's not subtle, it's not a feeling or a sense or a maybe. There are specific signs that the historical sources consistently mention, and learning to recognize these is essential for anyone serious about this work. First you'll experience the familiar making contact with you directly. This often happens during the conjuration itself, but can also occur in the days following a successful ritual. And the familiar will usually appear in some form, sometimes as animal, sometimes as maybe a humanoid figure, sometimes even a voice without a physical form. And the appearance might be visual, auditory, or even tactile. Again, this kind of goes back to like which flare sense you uh, really have more attuned to. And, some practitioners even report feeling the familiar touching them or moving around them before they can actually see it. Second, the familiar will demonstrate its capabilities in some way. And this might involve providing you with information that you couldn't have known otherwise, successfully completing a tasks that you assign it, or showing you something about its nature or origins. Real familiars come with verifiable proof of their abilities. They don't just exist in your head. The demonstration is usually something concrete that you can verify independently and not just a subjective feeling or impression. Third, the familiar will establish a communication method with you. And some familiars communicate telepathically, others through direct speech when they manifest physically, and some use more abstract methods like influencing your dreams or thoughts. But, there's always a clear, un- unambiguous way for these familiars to get messages to you. You'll just have to learn which one it is for your guy. So, once you've got a familiar spirit, the real work starts to begin. These entities aren't really the automatic servant type. Again, they're intelligent beings with their own personalities, preferences, and opinions. Yes, opinions. Building a good working relationship requires ongoing effort and mutual respect, just like any other important relationship in your life. Start by establishing regular communication sessions. Many practitioners set aside specific times daily or weekly to check in with their familiars, get updates on tasks that they've been assigned or discuss future work. Treat these kind of like business meetings or be prepared with clear questions and specific requests. Don't waste your familiar's time with, vague inquiries or casual chat unless they're into that kind of thing. Learn your familiar's particular strengths and limitations too. Each familiar has areas where it excels and where it struggles. Some are excellent for gathering information, but terrible at direct magical work. Others can influence people's emotions powerfully, but can't affect physical objects. And understanding these capabilities helps you work with the familiar more effectively and avoids frustration when you ask it to do something outside of its wheelhouse. Also, pay attention to your familiar's personality and preferences. Some familiars are all business and prefer direct, efficient communication, and others will enjoy more social interaction and might want to share observations about your life or the people around you. Some are naturally protective and will warn you about potential dangers even when you haven't asked, and others are more hands off and will only act when you specifically request. So now establish clear boundaries and expectations from the beginning. Familiar spirits often have strong opinions about how their abilities should be used, and they may resist or refuse certain types of tasks. It's better to discuss these limits up front rather than discover them when you need the familiar's help the most. And this is crucial. Familiar spirits are powerful entities with again, their own agendas. And without these boundaries, the relationship can be problematic. You need to establish what the familiar can and cannot do, when it can act independently and when it needs your explicit permission, and what happens if either party wants to end the relationship. Many traditional practitioners create written contracts with their familiars that spell these terms out explicitly. Well, it might seem a little bit overly formal, but I mean, if you're used to uh, servitor creation, this is pretty important. It prevents misunderstandings that could lead to serious problems later, and some familiars will attempt to expand their influence beyond what was originally agreed upon. They might start offering, unsolicited advice, interfering with relationships, or trying to influence major life decisions. While their input can be valuable, it's important to maintain your autonomy and make it clear that you're the senior partner in the relationship. If a familiar starts pushing boundaries or acting outside its agreed upon role, you need to address this immediately and pretty firmly. Letting boundary violations slide can lead to familiar becoming increasingly controlling or even demanding over time. Now, familiars need ongoing maintenance. They're like an old car. They need regular feeding, appropriate housing, which really I would like to do an episode on spirit houses and spirit programming, but for now, let's move on. And consistent attention to remain strong and cooperative. This isn't just an ancient superstition, it's a practical relationship. It's managing with a non human intelligence that operates by different rules than human relationships. Traditional feeding methods vary really depending on the type of familiar work you are working with. Demonic familiars often, not always, but often require some sort of blood offering. This is just a lancet, a few drops of your own blood. It's nothing theatrical. Um, Probably offered on specific days. The Pendle witch trial records consistently mention accused witches feeding their familiars with blood, and this practice shows up in grimoire traditions across Europe. It's not, again, about being all emo and dramatic. Blood carries life force in a concentrated form, and these entities can actually use it. Some familiars feed on energy rather than physical substances, and these might consume portions of your life force, emotional energy, or the energy generated by your magical work. While this sounds maybe concerning, it's usually more like a tax than a drain. Familiar takes a small percentage in exchange for significantly amplifying your overall magical effectiveness. Planetary familiars often prefer this type of feeding over physical offerings, and then housing familiar spirits often involves providing them with specific objects to inhabit or to be associated with. Sometimes, like, a servitor. This might be a special box or a piece of jewelry, a crystal, or a small statue, or a bottle, or, whatever you can think of. The familiar uses this object as a focus point for manifesting in the physical world and as a place to rest between tasks. Okay, so also, not every entity that claims to be a familiar spirit actually is one. There are parasitic entities, trickster spirits, and genuinely hostile beings that will try to establish false familiar relationships to gain access to your energy and influence over your life. Learning to identify these deceptive entities is essential for anyone serious about familiar spirit work, which is why gaining a familiar spirit is not necessarily for beginners because you need this experience of, you know, guess this particular discernment to be in your tool belt. Real familiar spirits come with verifiable abilities and demonstrate their value quickly. If an entity claiming to be your familiar only provides vague advice, never accomplishes concrete tasks, or seems to drain your energy without providing clear benefits, you're probably dealing with something else. True familiars are invested in your magical success because it benefits them as well, and parasites and tricksters are only interested in what they can take from you. When your familiar relationships go wrong, they can go very wrong. Some familiars become possessive or controlling, try to isolate you from other relationships, or influence major life decisions beyond their agreed upon role. Others might start making unreasonable demands for feeding or attention, or or like acting independently in ways that create problems in your life. So if you find yourself feeling like you're really no longer in control of the relationship, it's time to seriously consider ending it. And that means has to be a formal way of ending this relationship. And, the good news is that the most legitimate familiar relationships include these protocols for ending the partnership if necessary. This might involve formal dismissal rituals, returning the familiar to the entity that granted it, you know, taken back, or simply stopping the feeding and communication until the familiar just moves on to other work. So once you've established a stable working relationship with a familiar spirit, there are advanced techniques that can dramatically increase the effectiveness of your partnership. Some practitioners develop the ability to see through their familiar senses, essentially using the spirit for remote viewing or reconnaissance. Others learn to project their consciousness onto the familiar's form, allowing them to travel astrally or even appear in distant locations. And advanced familiar work often involves the spirit training you in magical techniques that would be difficult or impossible to learn from human teachers. Many familiars have access to knowledge systems and magical methods that aren't really even preserved in human grimoires or traditions. That's why there's a lot of secrecy here. Um, that's also why I'm not personally like sharing my personal experiences because a lot of times familiars will ask for that secrecy. Uh, it's pretty important. But some familiars can also help you establish relationships with other spiritual entities. They can act as intermediaries, vouching for your reliability and helping you negotiate with more powerful beings who might otherwise be inaccessible. There is, or this is like where, familiar spirits work starts to resemble what we might call spiritual networking. Your familiar introduces you to other entities in their hierarchy or sphere of influence, gradually expanding your access to non human intelligence and magical resources. So once you've worked successfully with a familiar spirit for an extended period, new possibilities open up that most practitioners never even hear about. Again, and you kind of just keep it to yourself because a lot of times there's that secrecy. And some familiars can help you establish networks with other spirits in the hierarchy or the sphere of influence. Your familiar essentially vouches for you with these other entities, making it easier to negotiate additional relationships or access more powerful beings who might otherwise ignore human requests. And, the more experienced practitioner, I guess, often works with multiple familiars simultaneously. And this is because each is specialized, back to the historical records. It's very common to see they are specialized for different types of magical work. And this requires some, skill in managing multiple spiritual relationships and preventing conflicts between different entities who might not get along with each other. So some familiars work well together and they can collaborate on complex operations. Others need to be kept completely separate to avoid problems. Learning to navigate these dynamics is part of the advanced familiar spirit work that can take years to master. And really, sometimes you can start to feel like the intermediary yourself when you have a lot of spirits to manage. But this kind of advanced work comes with its own risks and responsibilities. When you become a hub in spiritual networks, you also become responsible for managing the conflicts and the complications that can arise between different entities and even practitioners. It's really exciting work, but it's definitely not for everyone. So, there you have it. There's my whole rant on familiar spirits and all of their complex, powerful, and sometimes dangerous reality. Sorry if it was all over the place. I think I'm still trying to get like the hang of formatting all my thoughts into one like consistent uh formal outline, I guess. Um but really, this isn't, the cute, harmless version of familiar work that modern witchcraft likes to promote. This is serious magical work that requires real commitment and extensive preparation and really a willingness to enter into a long term relationship with a non human intelligence that has their own power and opinions. And the historical evidence is clear. From medieval grimoires to witch trial records to the private journals of learned magicians, familiar spirits have been a consistent part of effective magical practice for centuries. They're not pets, they're not psychological projections, and yes, they are not the same as created spirits like servitors. They are definitely not something you can just decide to have because it sounds cool. You need to be honest with yourself about whether you're ready for the level of responsibility and commitment that genuine familiar spirit work requires. Because if you do this right, if you approach it with the respect and seriousness it deserves, familiar spirits can open doors to magical capabilities and spiritual experiences that, most people never even dream about. But they're not a shortcut to power. They're not a partnership that, you know, you could just hand everything over to and expect them to do it for you. They're a partnership that demands everything you've got and gives back even more in return. So I hope all of you who listen took something useful, at least one thing useful from this podcast episode today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into familiar spirits. I hope this episode, again, has given you more of a realistic understanding of what this practice, actually involves. And until next time, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.